This is Dan Esty from Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. We're going to wait just another minute or two while our participants are coming through the Zoom system and getting into the program today. We're excited about the opportunity to share with you our results from a couple of years of effort analyzing environmental performance on a range of issues and ranging across the world, looking at 180 different countries and how they're doing in addressing the sustainability challenges that are out there. Again, it's a particular pleasure to be able to have all of you from around the world with us today. This is perhaps the silver lining in the dark cloud of our current pandemic moment. And that is to say that we would otherwise have probably done this live in one location and had a much smaller audience that could have participated. So we are in some ways linked globally in our moment of isolation, but with the ability to together gather online and to really dig into some of the critical issues of the day. So it is with that I will now start. I'm Dan Esty, director of the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy, one of the folks on the team at Yale that is the co-lead of this effort, along with colleagues at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. And I am joined on this webinar today in terms of presentation with the colleagues, the core Environmental Performance Index team that's been working on this, as I mentioned, for 2 years, working to comb through global data sets on the full spectrum of sustainability challenges, trying to bring to bear the best information possible to understand who's leading and frankly, who's lagging when it comes to the sustainability imperative. I think all of you on this call are aware of the need to move society toward a sustainable future, particularly one that addresses the challenges of climate change. And today we report out on how things are going, who's doing well, who's not so well. I'm going to turn over the virtual microphone in just a moment to Zach Wendling, who's the project director of our Environmental Performance Index and has really led the team of dozens of folks working on this effort, including partner organizations across the world and a team at Yale and at Columbia as well. We'll then invite G.A. Emerson, who's my colleague and a professor in the Yale Department of Statistics and Data Science, to talk a little bit about the methodology, the analytic rigor beneath this analysis. And then we'll invite Alex Desherbinen, who does come from the Columbia University Earth Institute, to offer a perspective on some of the issues that he's been the lead position on. We then do have 2 ministers from the Danish government. It's a special pleasure to welcome Dan Jørgensen, Minister of Climate, Energy and Utilities, and Lea Wermelin, Minister of the Environment in the nation of Denmark. And without revealing now any secrets, Denmark has emerged as #1 on our scorecard for the first time, pushing past some of the other countries that have historically led the position, including Switzerland in our last analysis, and Finland before that. So it's a special pleasure to have some representation from the Danish government and hope that they can help us think about what Denmark's been doing that ends up in the top slot here today. And again, our analysis looks at 2 broad categories of activity, 2 broad elements of the sustainability challenge: environmental public health, effective environmental issues on people, and ecosystem vitality. How do nations do in protecting nature? We're looking across the world. 180 countries are in this scorecard. 32 different indicators, different data sets are tracked in 11 core policy categories that Zach Wendling will talk about in a moment. I do want to say that we are, of course, gathered at a challenging moment from the global point of view. The U.S. has seen in the last few weeks some very fundamental issues, racial justice and deeper structural inequality, come to the fore in a profound and upsetting way. And I think some of the burdens of that inequality are visible here in the analysis that we will discuss, visible in particularly some of the environmental public health exposures. And these are issues, of course, of profound concern right now in the United States, but there are similar issues of inequality more broadly. And all of that, of course, comes on top of the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic distress that has been pushed all across the world as a result. And that, again, has revealed quite significant inequalities in who bears the burden of this exposure to the COVID-19 disease who bears the exposure from environmental consequences, as well as the economic downsides that we're now seeing all across the world. All of that leads to where we might otherwise have started today, which is that tomorrow is June 5th, Global Environment Day, and a moment for the world community to step back and assess how we're doing individually, on a nation-state basis, and collectively across the whole globe in responding to the need to push toward a sustainable future. And I think what we see in the Environmental Performance Index that comes to the fore today, the 2020 version of this that is updated with fresh data, fresh analysis, that there are real issues, some of which are improving across the world. More people are getting better access to water and sanitation, but real challenges as well, particularly climate change and the need to move towards a carbonized future. And on some issues, the world community is collectively doing pretty well. On other issues, not so well. In fact, every nation, of course, has a role to push toward a sustainable future and particularly a clean energy economy that will allow us to address climate change. And it's true, of course, that no nation can succeed on its own. So this is a challenge of collective action. We want to call out and celebrate those who are doing well, particularly today, Denmark in the #1 spot. But even Denmark has work to do. I think that's important for us all to recognize. Nobody fully sustainable trajectory. And therefore, there is a look at the best practices of those who issue by issue in the top slots and ask whether we can do some of the same. And for those who are lagging, and there's a chance to identify issue by issue where country is doing well and not doing so well. And for each country, we want to provide an opportunity to view the 2020 EPI as a spur to further action. So without further delay, let me turn to Zach Wendling to begin to introduce the results. We intend about 20 more minutes of opening comments and commentary, introducing the issues and allowing our Danish guests to comment on Denmark's performance and what it might tell us in terms of best practices others might look to and how it is that Denmark has moved into this leadership posture. And then we will take your questions. So please do use the Q&A function that's available at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we will be trying to get to as many of those questions as we can in about 20 minutes. So with that, Zach, let me turn this over to you. And thanks again to all of you for signing in.
Right. Well, good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, depending on where you happen to be. I'm very excited to bring you the results from the 2020 Environmental Performance Index. As Dan mentioned, it's a composite index. It is made up of 32 different indicators over 11 issue categories into 2 broad policy objectives. This is, I believe, the most comprehensive environmental performance index that we've produced yet. We always try to expand it to include more and more issues, indicators, things that tell us deep insights into how the world is doing. If you'd like to follow along, you can go to our website, which is now live, and find all of the results there, as well as individual country profiles if you're curious about how a certain country is doing. And that will link not only to the page, but a 3-page PDF that you can download and use as a scorecard. So overall, as Dan mentioned, we're happy to recognize Denmark as a world leader in environmental performance, coming in first place with a score of 82.5 out of a 100-point scale. This, of course, highlights that they are doing the best in the world, but there is extra room at the top to continue to the drive towards sustainability. The top 10 are mostly European countries who have made long-term investments in public health and also environmental protection and strong commitments to tackling sustainability challenges, especially climate change. The USA comes at 24th, the bottom of wealthy democracies, followed by South Korea and Croatia. At the very bottom of the index, we also see countries like Liberia, Myanmar, and Afghanistan. This would be a result of many factors, not only civil unrest and also weak governance, but also poverty, which means that there is a special burden that's placed upon the more developed world to assist the laggards to bring them up to levels where we can attain international sustainable development goals. We also see large movements of some countries that are slipping over time, like Bhutan and Burundi, or countries that are having surges, climbing up the rankings, most notably Seychelles and Bahrain, which are making notable investments in their climate change strategies. Breaking this down regionally, we also have analyses on our website available for you guys to scan through, how you're doing not only within the world, but within your region, and how the regions compare against each other. At the top, we have the Global West, which would be Western Europe, United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, followed by Eastern Europe, where we have strong trends towards decarbonization, or at least cleaning up their energy and industrial sectors. And so, of special note, in this edition of the EPI, we placed 24% of the total weight on climate change and broadened our suite of indicators to include a range of different greenhouse gas emissions, plus other indicators of your overall performance and how intensive your economy is and your population is with regard to climate change mitigation. And of course, the largest part of that is going to be CO2 emissions. So within this essential issue category, we can also break this down further. In any level of the EPI, you can look down further to find individual results for countries and their rankings at the indicator level, the issue category, or the policy objective. So within climate change, again, Denmark is leading the world, having a 10-year change of climbing up 19.6 points in our scores. So a decade ago, they would have not done so well. So this is long-term investments and decarbonization strategies that are paying off, followed by the United Kingdom, and then some Eastern European countries as they start to replace dirtier, more polluting capital that was installed in former times. Unfortunately, we also see some countries slipping down further than what they need to be. China and India kind of mid-range, and India not making much progress. But we do see that China, over the past 10 years, has pursued a decarbonization strategy that is pushing them up the rankings. Unfortunately, at the very bottom, we do see a lot of countries that are slipping behind, most notably Nigeria and Mongolia. So likewise, you can break this down by region to see who is climbing ahead and who is falling behind, who is going to need help, and who can serve as leaders and exemplars. We can also look globally. As a whole, how's the world doing on climate change? And unfortunately, we see halting progress or even some slippage, as we see with black carbon emissions or our brand new indicator on CO2 emissions from land cover change is a trend over 15 years. We're seeing more and more CO2 coming off from deforestation and other losses of biomass. But we are happy to highlight the progress that Denmark has done. Every country has a scorecard where you can see where they're leading and also where they're lagging, both with respect to the absolute 0 to 100 score, but relative to the world average and also to regional averages. All of this can be explored further at our website, and we'd be happy to walk countries or curious individuals through the different metrics and indicator construction techniques. That's all fully documented and available for people to explore. And with that, I think I've given you guys a great brief overview, and I'll turn it over to Jay to talk a little bit more about the mechanics and the technical side of things.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Dan. I'll make some very brief remarks. Obviously, we're mostly concerned with terrific data quantity and quality. Quantity, we need to be able to cover, of course, many countries. It doesn't do us any good to have data sources, say, that do an excellent job for the European Union, but fail to cover the rest of the world. And data quality speaks for itself. And this is always a challenge, and we've worked for almost 2 decades now to get better and better data sources. One thing that we've always been committed to and fully committed to is transparency. All of the results will be available on the web today. They might even be available now at epi.yale.edu. We're completely transparent in terms of the methodology. That includes clearly defining transformations that we use, weights across different issues and categories, targets for good and bad performance, methods for aggregation. All of that is very clearly defined, and we acknowledge that there's no one correct way of doing this. We've assembled a terrific team that does its best. to put together a consensus. But if you, the researcher, would like to explore this on your own, everything's available, and we welcome participation from teams around the world. Finally, I'd like to just point out that we do have an independent sensitivity analysis that's conducted by the Joint Research Center of the European Union. We're very pleased to have that contribution to the effort. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Alex Sherbinen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jay. It's a real pleasure to be here. I represent the Columbia side of the partnership, and I work at the Earth Institute here in New York City. I'd like to speak briefly about the EPI 2020 results for two policy categories: biodiversity and habitat, and ecosystem services. Although the climate crisis has tended to dominate policy attention of late, and for good reason, given the magnitude of the challenges and the headline-grabbing disasters such as cyclones and forest fires, it's really important to recognize that biodiversity and ecosystem services are being degraded at unprecedented rates. So biodiversity underpins all ecosystem services and acts as the foundation of all human activities, our economies, and our well-being. And natural ecosystems and species pollinate crops, build healthy soils, cycle and replenish fresh water, protect against extreme weather events, provide food, energy, medicines, raw materials, and cultural and spiritual benefits for all people on the planet. So this is really what is meant by ecosystem services. The EPI has continued to evolve its approach to measurement in these two policy categories. In 2020, under biodiversity and habitat, we have 6 metrics. 3 of those metrics have to do with protected areas coverage, for terrestrial protected areas, marine protected areas, and for species. The first 2 are against the international targets of 17% coverage set by the Convention on Biological Diversity. The species measure looks at how each country's protected areas actually line up against the species distributions within the country. Then we have 3 measures based on remote sensing imagery and species inventories that look at the extent of habitat loss and in and outside of protected areas. So we want to thank our colleagues at the Biodiversity Indicator Partnership for those 3 indicators. So biodiversity and habitat is a category in which some of the best performers are actually in Southern Africa, including Botswana and Zambia, followed by European countries. And one thing that we've seen is that while protected areas coverage is actually going up globally, and we see now almost 17% of coastal areas and about 14% of terrestrial areas globally are covered by protected areas, we continue to see species extinctions. So clearly more needs to be done to increase the effectiveness of protected areas, but also to control habitat loss and invasive species. Finally, for ecosystem services, the mainstay of our measurement continues to be forest cover change. However, this year we added 2 remote sensing derived indicators based on innovative work by colleagues at the University of Cincinnati. One is for grassland loss and the other is for wetland loss. Small countries, including some island nations like Iceland, Malta, and Sao Tome and Principe, tend to do best on ecosystem services, followed by a mix of dryland West African and Central Asian countries. A number of tropical West African countries, however, are doing very poorly, and those include Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, where forest cover change and loss is really accelerating. So that is my brief wrap up on the methods and results in these categories, and I hand it back to Dan Esty. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alex, Jay, Zach. And I'd now like to invite the Danish ministers to step up. Minister Jørgensen, perhaps you can start by giving us a perspective on what Denmark's doing on climate change and anything you'd like to share about where Denmark plans to go in the months and years ahead.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting us to speak. Thank you so much for the important work that you're doing. I think it's obvious to everybody that if we are to solve some of the big challenges with regards to climate change and biodiversity, no country alone, certainly not a small one like Denmark, can do all that's necessary. So we need to learn from each other, we need to collaborate, and that's why your work is so important. So thank you so much on behalf of the Danish government for that. Now, I want to start with one concrete example of what it is that we are doing. We have adopted a climate act, a climate law in the Danish parliament with broad support that legally binds us to reduce our CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, by 70% compared to 1990 in 2030. Now, this probably makes us the most ambitious country on reductions in the world, I would think. Definitely for us, it's a huge challenge. If we look at how much we have reduced from 1990 and until now, we need to reduce with as much in the next 10 years as we've done from 1990 until now. So that tells you a little bit about the challenge that we've set for ourselves. Now, the target of 70% is not a normal political target. Normally, when we negotiate the levels of ambitions in Danish politics, I guess that's probably much the same in all countries in the world. What you do is you analyze what is the problem, then you analyze what kind of policy instruments do you have, then you analyze how much resources have you got, and then you start negotiating, and then you find a result. But we've started at a little bit in a different way this time. So instead of starting by saying, okay, so what's possible, we've actually started by asking what's necessary. We've asked the scientists, how much should we reduce our emissions if we are to fulfill the criteria of the Paris Agreement and thereby give our contribution to the planet being able to stay below 1.5 degrees. And that is then the number 70%. So our task is then to make the necessary possible. How will we do it? Well, it's a difficult task, but I think one primary part of the solution that I want to underline is that really you've invited the Minister of Environment and the Minister of Climate, and thank you for that, but actually the entire government should be here, because if we are to make progress like that, changes like that, you cannot do it from just two isolated ministries. You need the entire government aboard. And what we've done is a structural change in the way we make decisions in the Danish government. Just as we have had an economic committee in our governments in Denmark for, I think, more than 50 years, and I think most countries have this around the planet, we now also have a committee for green transition with 7 ministers, meaning that it's not only Lea Wermelin, the Minister of Environment, and me discussing green transition policy. It's also the Minister of Transport, it's also the Minister of Taxation, it's also the Minister of Research and Science, the Minister of Agriculture, and so forth. Only if you look at environmental challenge as an integrated part of your overall policy as a government will you reach the results that you need, is our belief. Now, what does it mean to be a world leader? We aim to be one because we are a small country. If we are to do anything that will make a difference, we know that we are only responsible for 0.1% of the planet's CO2 emissions. So even if we close down our country tomorrow, it probably wouldn't help the planet much. Instead, we need to make policies that can inspire, that will force ourselves to invent new solutions, create new policies that others then might copy. We have done this in the past. We were the first country in the world to build an offshore wind farm in 1991. When we did that, a lot of economists were shaking their heads and said, that's a very expensive way to create electricity. Why on earth are you doing that? But today, of course, offshore wind competes with coal and is being built all over the world without subsidies. Not only because of Denmark, but partly because we started that process in 1991. Now we wish to take the step forward. We want to make a new step of progress in offshore wind, a new era, so to speak. So we are negotiating in the Danish Parliament right now to create 2 energy islands that will be hubs for offshore wind, making that we can exploit the wind further out on the sea, meaning that we can integrate power-to-X technologies where we transform the power from the wind into first hydrogen and then fluids that we can then put on a plane or a ship or a heavy vehicle. So basically what we're looking at is that in a not too distant future, we will have wind from a turbine on the sea, creating the power that will fly a plane. For us, it used to be science fiction, now it's just science. We need to upscale it, we need to make it possible. A final point from me. if we are to do these things, I think it's extremely important that we do it in a way that are also socially acceptable, meaning that we cannot afford to lose jobs, growth, create inequality in our societies. I think that if we set ourselves a target that was so ambitious that we had to close down production in our country, I don't think other countries would look at us and say, look, this is an example that we want to follow. I think they might look at us and say, see, this is what happens if you're too ambitious. So we really want to follow a track where we do this in collaboration with our industries, with our businesses. And that's also why I'm extremely happy that the Danish Business Association, even the Danish agricultural sector that are not normally seen as extremely progressive in the past anyway, are now supporting our 70% target. And that, I think, is essential if we are to reach it. So once again, thank you so much for doing this important work. We are proud to be number one on the list. We aim to stay there, but we really welcome competition because only if we see transformation from many other countries will we get the progress that we need. Thank you so much.
Minister Jørgensen, thank you very much for those comments. It is really a pleasure to hear what Denmark's doing, and especially a pleasure to hear that the agenda you've set, the ambitious agenda on climate change, is being done with an eye towards ongoing economic success at the same time. I think that is the only model that countries out across the world will want to follow, and it does represent, I think, an element of the Danish leadership that we hope others will look to. The other thing that our analysis suggests is that Denmark's move, always from the top tier, but now into the number one slot, is a function of success not only on climate change, although the government's current efforts and recent push on this is clearly evidenced in the rankings, but it really is, and this is where Minister Vermeulen, I think you'll come in. It's a broader commitment to sustainability. It really is looking at the full sweep of issues. And one of the things that we recognize is that Denmark's, of course, doing very, very well on climate change, although, as we've all discussed, more needs to be done. But it's also doing very well on water, on waste, on air pollution, on protection of nature in a number of regards. So, Minister Vermeulen, if you can pick up the story and tell us a little bit more about what's going on in that regard.
Sure, I would like to do that. And thank you once again for inviting us here and for doing all this great work in terms of looking at our environmental performances across countries. I think it's very important that we benchmark our efforts, and as Dan was saying, that we're also using it as a competition towards even more greener ambitions in the future. I wanted to highlight some key principles for the Danish environmental policy approach throughout the years. Firstly, I believe that the key for Danish achievements within environmental and climate is that we've had ambitious, long-lasting targets for environment. And as Dan already mentioned, we now have the 70% target. So we've always looked for a very clear targets in the future. It's been a key driver for both Danish policies for many years, and we've been agreeing on it nationally as well as our international goals as well. And that has provided the long-term stable framework for green investments and transitions in our industry as well. Secondly, I believe that the Danish partnership approach to environmental challenges and solution has been extremely important. And Dan, you also mentioned that now we've involved the industry in our climate action, and we work very closely with our green NGOs, the business community, and the labor unions in order to promote these solutions to environmental challenges. And lastly, it's obviously important that the public is also engaged in these green agendas. So we've seen it throughout the world with the climate action, but we also have a long tradition in Denmark for science-based regulation, impact assessments, evaluations, and information sharing in Denmark. So the Danish school system, the public service of media is very important also in this regard. The trust in science, knowledge in Denmark is very high, and I think that's also very important. But as you also shown us in the scorecard, we still have some way to go, even though we rank high on the index. And I believe that it is also essential that we use the time today to stress that we are presently in an ecological crisis and that the crisis is global. So production, consumption, and sourcing has negative consequences outside our national borders as well, and we are all affected by not only climate change but also the loss of biodiversity. So in September last year, when we met in New York for the General Assembly, the heads of states concluded that we're not on a sustainable path globally. So we have to make progress in these areas, and it's not happening fast enough today. We will not meet our green sustainable development goals without significantly changing the way we consume and produce. The climate crisis is of course imminent, and what Dan was also stressing, we're trying to collaborate very closely, linking it also to the fact that we're in the middle of the sixth extinction crisis of global biological diversity. So the goal of the Danish government is to pursue a sustainable policy in which Denmark again takes the lead on the green transition. We're significantly raising our ambitions not only for climate but also for environment and nature. And it is important that we do more for nature and biological diversity. We need to do more nationally in Denmark as well, and I'm currently now preparing a new biodiversity strategy for Denmark, where we've also invited all of the actors in the area to come up with good ideas for how we move forward. So I hope that what we do in Denmark, as well as what we're doing in the European Union with now the biodiversity strategy for Europe, also presented, very ambitious as well. I hope that next year will be the year with breakthroughs, not only for climate, but also for biodiversity solutions. And the Danish government will be very much engaged in that work together with our key partners here in Denmark, but also in Europe and globally. So thank you very much to the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy and Columbia University for working on this index and making us push for even more greener future together. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Vermelin, and thank you as well for highlighting the range of challenges. You've made a couple of remarks that I think address some of the questions that people are beginning to ask. One thing that is for sure, and both you and Minister Jørgensen have said this, it does take investment to address these issues. And it's clear that countries that have foreign direct investment, particularly in the developing world, are outperforming those that do not. So one of the other observations, perhaps one level down from the top line we're discussing today, is that the flow of capital is critical to getting the kind of investments in environmental public health infrastructure, in particular, water systems, waste systems, sanitation, but also the ability to protect nature. And if there is a top crisis just below climate change, it would be biodiversity. So Minister Vermelin, thank you for addressing that. The world has much to do. And if we were to poke a little bit at Denmark, it seems like this might be an issue where Denmark still has some work to do as well. And one of the striking features of the Environmental Performance Index is that no country is doing well on everything. So even our star of the day, Denmark, has challenges with regard to ecosystem services and protecting nature that suggests there is room for progress. But I think the evidence, again, is that sustained effort and government policy does pay off. One of the other things that we won't have time to discuss in full detail in this webinar, but I hope some of you will find to be of interest and dig into the details that are online, is what are the drivers of good results? And we've already said that government focus matters, structured policy matters, a commitment to leadership is important. And again, Denmark represents this in a very nice way. But I think it's also the case that good governance more broadly turns out to be critical to delivering good results systematically over time. And that, I would argue, explains some of the other countries at the top of the rankings. The United Kingdom, perhaps where good governance was invented hundreds of years ago, has moved steadily towards the top of the rankings. And I think that does represent the ongoing vigor of public debate in the United Kingdom, the recognition of the importance of transparency, of being open with data, of acknowledging mistakes, of accepting that the science may tell us we need to do more and different things in some regards. So all of that is important to results, and that helps to explain, by the way, some of the questions that have come in. I do want to mention one more thing that Minister Vermeulen just highlighted, and that is the importance of recognizing that our index does not fully capture the important issues where consumption occurs in one country, but the production occurs somewhere else. In effect, some countries, and the United States certainly represents this, but some degree Denmark, and all of the more wealthy developed countries have some degree of the pollution harm that they benefit from the goods, but the production is elsewhere. And that is a core commitment of our team in terms of how we want to go forward. We do think there needs to be some ability to measure, and we've begun to do some work on this that is being pushed out over the next couple of months on this production consumption challenge and how to deal with traded goods, where the consumption occurs in one country, but the pollution harm in the production process is somewhere else. So we will be advancing that issue, and that is part of the response globally to create a more sustainable society. I want to now turn to some of the questions that have come in online, and want to just share with you. I think some of this is probably for Zach, but I'm happy to have anyone else who wants to take a shot at this well. So one of the questions is there a way to capture interactions across the issues? We know, for example, that the scores on environmental public health are highly correlated with wealth. Again, countries with money, with capital to invest, are able to build sewage treatment systems, wastewater, drinking water systems, collect the garbage, and so on. But it seems that some of the challenge, particularly protection of nature, may be slightly different. So Zach, do you want to comment on what we see as the tensions across these issues, or do they all seem amenable to the same kind of policy response?
I think it's a great question, and it's certainly something that a lot of people are interested in, especially if you're thinking about comprehensive pushes towards sustainability. You want to capture co-benefits. So tackling climate change can also help improve air pollution problems. If you want to have a little slice of what kind of analyses you might want to do, the audit that was done by the Joint Research Center at the European Commission, that's available for download at our website, does show a basic correlation analysis of how these different indicators and issue categories are related to each other. And whether or not that might have an underlying causal mechanism would probably be something that would require further analysis that would go beyond the scope of what the EPI would do. But in general, yes, I think there are definitely linkages within the environment, things that we know about how these things can either reinforce each other or undermine each other. And I think that's why it takes a real concerted effort at the government level, like you heard the ministers talking about making long-term plans and targets that try to take into account the complexity. And so listening to your scientists, it's a very important thing to do. But I think also I want to highlight the important part of getting a broader voice to everyone who might be able to recognize these things. So we know that one of the indicators of good governance from our colleagues at the World Bank is voice and accountability. Are you listening to everyone's voices who could have something useful and important to hear about? And so I think that's why that's another great indicator from the Danish government about involving a wide variety of stakeholders can help to spot those kinds of trends.
So Zach, one other question that perhaps goes your way is to talk a little bit about the process used for aggregation. How do we bring together these 32 different indicators into the 11 policy categories and ultimately into the two broad elements of focus, environmental public health and ecosystem vitality? And who determines and how are the weightings determined?
Well, I would defer to Jay, who said it very, very well earlier, that there's no one perfect way of doing this. And we've just arrived at a way of doing it that we can defend and makes sense for us. But if people have different ideas, about what kind of weights you would attach to different indicators, or if you would put more emphasis on certain issue categories. You're welcome to download the data and try to run the analysis using those alternatives. And indeed, if you look at the audit from the JRC, they've done just such an analysis with a couple of our issue categories, but there's lots of room for people to explore this and think of new ways. We try to be responsive to what the world is interested in and what the science is telling us. And that would be that the largest issue categories the world's facing are climate change, biodiversity loss, and air quality, especially in the developing world. And so those have received a lot of weight in our indicator as a recognition of this is probably where a lot of policy attention should be focused. But other people might have different opinions, and we'd be open to people bringing to us their analyses and understandings of why they might come up with a new way or a different way of doing this.
So Zach, let me just add to that. And I say this because Jay and I have been working on this project now for 2 decades. One of the things that we start with is what the environmental science or ecological science world tells us are the critical issues. So we, at the early outset of the work on this project now 2 decades ago, brought together experts from across the fields of environmental policy and asked, what is it governments should pay attention to? And then we went out and looked for data on those issues. And it turns out if you see an issue missing from this analysis, it's almost always because there are not good global data sets. And even though the world of environmental policy has become much more data-driven in recent years, and the UN has now helped sharpen the focus with the Sustainable Development Goals that have given us concrete policy objectives across 17 different big issue areas, it still remains the case that some areas of important policy focus, water issues particularly, waste, which we have a pilot indicator for the first time, but we don't have good toxic waste management data across countries. We don't have wetlands protection data. So we know there are significant gaps. And that is one of the things that we're eager to improve. And let me reiterate something that Jay mentioned and Zach has really mentioned as well, and that is that we are eager to take this analysis constantly forward. We consider it a work in progress. We recognize that there are a number of issues not as well measured as they could be and should be. So we would be very pleased to have any of you who are listening in tell us where you see global data sets that have the kind of 180 country coverage that we need, but would allow us to bring into the analysis some of the issues that are not currently there. But Jay, anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think you've touched upon it, Dan. As you say, there's real issues in considering new data sources with respect to coverage across countries and over time. We do our best. We always do a complete search of new possible sources, and we'll continue to do so. And we certainly welcome contributions. If you're aware of some new efforts out there that maybe are only just becoming visible, please do get in touch with us. We would love to have additional sources that we can work from and consider.
And let me just add one other thing that responds to one of the questions that's come in online, which is why we focus on a regional performance and compare countries to other nations that are in the same geographic zone, although we also provide a number of other peer groups that countries can use to judge their performance in context against others that might be similarly situated. And that really does respond to the reality of the world being very diverse. Countries are in quite different places, not only geographically, but in terms of economic development. And we have always found that the countries learn most from looking at those who are similarly situated and asking what they are doing that is different as a way to understand what might be a reasonable aspiration for how to improve. And just one quick example before I turn to our Danish colleagues to see if they have a closing thought to share. There are countries that are quite similarly situated and yet very different in their results in terms of the Environmental Performance Index. And I think if one is sitting in Haiti at 170th rank and wondering why the performance is not as good as Denmark, no one would have ever thought Haiti was about to be Denmark. And they weren't thinking they could really compare themselves to Luxembourg, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, or France either. But if you're in Haiti, you might ask why you're at 170th place when the Dominican Republic, with whom you share the island of Hispaniola, is in 74th place. So that's in effect a controlled experiment where one nation sharing the same geography is doing quite well, at least as a developing nation, and the other has got significant challenges across almost the whole spectrum of issues. So we do think putting the data in context is critical. We would urge people not to look at the top line scores. Even Denmark, we would say, don't celebrate too long about number one. Please do look down at the 11 categories beneath, at least one of which Denmark lags behind where its regional peers are, and dig below that into indicator by indicator, really provide the kind of granular feedback we think policymakers need. But with that, please let's pause for one last moment to see if Minister Jørgensen or Minister Vermelin would like to offer a last thought before we close out here today.
As well, thank you so much, and that was also a very interesting discussion. I have just a few points. One is that I totally agree that really, if you are to have a more honest view of a country, you need to look at the way the country consumes things that they import from other countries. We try to remedy the fact that we don't do that yet in the future by having it as an integrated part of our yearly obligation to the Danish Parliament that we need to make a report about our global commitments. Meaning that not only do we have to report how much are we reducing our emissions, which policies are implemented, we also have a development track that shows whether or not we are on track to reaching our target. Not only are we doing that, we are also trying more qualitatively to describe, so what are our global footprint? And I hate to say that if you were able to measure that already now, we probably wouldn't be number one on the list, because we are a fairly wealthy country and we consume a lot of stuff that's being produced other places on the planet. So we need to take care of that. On the other hand, we also export a lot of energy solutions, especially a lot of water and waste. Leah can probably say something about that. My favorite example is that we sent 4 engineers to Beijing that helped them introduce a new system to avoid curtailment. That is, how do you get electricity from wind into your electricity grid? How do you turn up and down the power plants? That was a huge problem. And that advice alone and the expertise alone led to reductions of emissions that, if you compare to Denmark, that equals 62% of the entire Danish emissions. So we are definitely not the good guys if you look at our consumption. On the other hand, we are trying also to share our technology. We're not only doing this because we want to sell technology and develop technology that will create jobs and growth. We want that as well, of course, but we also have an idealistic approach to this. We have bilateral collaborations with 16 countries that all in all cover 60% of the globe's emission on issues like this. Where can we help? And I think that if you guys and your excellent work can also focus on some of these things, that might also help inspire more countries, including my own, to do even more of that sort in the future. And then just one final point. We also really need to look into, I think, on an international level, what is it that we consider sustainable? I know that you guys are experts on this, but let me just mention one example, which is biomass. So one of the reasons why we're doing really well is that we have quite a lot of biomass, and in the United Nations ways of looking at this, that's seen as renewable. But to be honest, is it really necessarily sustainable? We try to make criteria now to make it sustainable, but for me, that's probably one of the biggest headaches that I have right now. Is I want my 70% target, whether or not I reach that or not doesn't have anything to do with if we import biomass. But is that fair? Not really. So that I think also we need to work at a United Nations level. Thank you.
Minister, thank you for your insights there, and for frankly the modesty which reflects our own view as well. And that even though a particular view of the scores puts Denmark on top, there are questions, and your question about biomass is a good one. I think we are also committed in this effort to continue to track the science, and I think the evolving science on biofuels is raising questions about whether they're truly carbon neutral. So it's a good example of where the goals here are important to look for, but also recognize it's a bit of a moving target. Minister Vermaelen.
Well, thank you, and thank you for a very interesting debate just now. I just wanted to put in a last point on the economic recovery now after the whole COVID-19, where I think it's very important that we all work together to make sure that we are now looking into a green recovery of economies across the globe. So the point about linking together the work on climate, nature, air quality, waste, all of the things that are important in order to make sure that we have a sustainable development, that we link this to the economic recovery now in Europe as well as across the globe. So I hope that we will be able to do that together. And then actually we are now heading off, the climate minister and I, to negotiations with the Danish parliament in terms of making our waste sector even greener. So we're very committed to making sure that we will keep staying at the top of the list. So thank you very much for today.
Well, let me thank the two ministers. Your participation here is much appreciated. So pleased that you're heading off to work on the waste issue. It is one of the new metrics in this year's analysis compared to our prior 10 different analyses where there was not good enough waste data. And waste has emerged as a critical factor, not only in terms of water contamination and local issues, but because of methane release. And I guess if there's one closing thought that I'd like to offer, it is that good policy does matter. So I'm thrilled to hear continuing work over these issues, recognizing there are often not easy answers. There are real trade-offs that's going to be done in the context of continued economic success and delivery of goods and services to the public more broadly. So all of that is one of the lessons. We do encourage those who are interested in the deeper story to go to the website, epi.yale.edu. All of the methodology is explained there. All of the data are there. More information on the drivers of good results are there. So with that, I do want to bring this to a close. I want to echo the commitment that the minister has just suggested, that we should all be thinking about our post-COVID-19 moment as a chance to build back better. And we at the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy have a program going on that, which we will be sharing information on over the coming weeks and months. So let me thank my colleagues who presented. A special thanks to Tim Mason, who's appeared in the corner, although not speaking. He's been our virtual master of ceremonies and keeping the technology flowing. We are very grateful for all of you, hundreds of you who've signed in from around the world. And we do want to commit to you that this is not a one-time thing, but rather what we hope will be the beginning of an ongoing conversation. And we're very committed to helping you all wherever you are in government, in the non-government sector, in academia, in the business world, to identify the best paths forward toward a sustainable future. So with that, we sign off from New Haven, Connecticut today, but with the conversation that's stretched around the world, and are grateful for the participation of all of you in that dialogue. Please do send us your feedback, your thoughts, your comments, your critiques. We're committed to a process of continuous improvement. Again, thanks very much, and goodbye from Yale.